Hello, I'm Steph from iDriver Classic, and today I'm looking at a car that has been on my dream drive list for quite some time. It's the Standard 10. It's the post-war model, and this one is from 1958. Now, as a Morris Minor driver, this was very much in the target market for someone who was looking for a Morris Minor or perhaps an Austin A30, which makes today's test quite interesting because I'm so in love with the competitor. What am I going to think of the Standard 10? Now, this particular example we're testing here today is a very well-loved example. In fact, this car is driven as a daily driver, and so many classics aren't nowadays. So it's quite nice to take something out which is perhaps a little bit more weathered than some of the other shinier show ponies that we have on the channel sometimes. So without further delay, let's kick off, have a good look round and find out about the Standard 10. After the Second World War, car manufacturers, which had been away from the drawing board for a number of years due to supporting the war effort, were suddenly back with pencil and paper and drawing for a whole new world with new demands. However, look, many of these companies just didn't have the budget to create something totally new. We often talk about the successes which came from the 1948 Earls Court Motor Show, cars like the 2CV, the Morris Minor, even things like the Austin Atlantic. But we never really talk about what post-war Britons really wanted, which was motoring, but cheap as possible, and people were willing to accept an awful lot less than perhaps they would do today. Sir John Black, who was head of Standard and quite a canny businessman, did quite well in the 40s because he did things like he purchased Triumph cars because they'd gone bust. He bought Ferguson tractors, and with that he then pushed on with his strategy. And his strategy was he wanted to create a car which would rival the Morris Minor as a budget saloon because he saw what people wanted. He saw that people were quite happy to do away with the frills and pomp and just have a really cheap car that they could rely on. Because bear in mind, we're talking about a world which is before MOTs, before the motorway. People were travelling a lot slower, shorter distances, but also were travelling around in cars which were maybe not as safe as the cars that we have today, even the classics that are left today, because no one was really testing anything. Which then meant in 1953, the company welcomed in the Standard 8. Now, the Standard 8 is a really interesting car because if you look at the 8 horsepower, which ran until 1948, you'll see that the styling leap, in my opinion, is brave, it's enormous, and the new 8 felt and looked a darn sight more modern. And did you know it was also Standard's first unitary built car? And the early ones have integrated panels. They changed that later on because it made repairing crash damaged cars just totally unfeasible. Now, the car was a completely new design for Standard and paired with the Standard SC overhead valve engine. It was only ever offered as a 4-door saloon, just like the Standard 10 actually, and it was paired with the 803cc engine, and it offered no luxuries at base spec. Look, there wasn't even a boot lid. You accessed the space by pulling down the rear seat, and it was a split rear seat as well, and you see that design idea copied later on, and that was really inspired a lot by these cars. Although look, if you did pay a little bit extra from 1954 onwards, you could get all the nice to haves, things like wind down windows, the little things that you might have been missing out on, which then leads us quite into 1954 very nicely. And what happened in 1954? Well, the Standard 10 came to market, just like we're testing here today. And the 10 shared that body and the running gear that they'd used in the 8. And a little like the 8 naming convention, the 10 name had been used on cars since 1906. However, unlike the Edwardian 10 horsepower Standard, these post-war Standard 10s offered so much more than their namesake, and actually of the Standard 8 as well. So what changed? Well, the engine in the 8 was that wheezy 803cc, but in the 10 they upped it to a 948cc. And that achieved 0 to 60 in around 38 seconds. And I'm reliably informed that even when driven with enthusiasm, you could still command a number around the mid to high 30s in terms of miles per gallon. Size-wise, the car is 144 inches long, that's 3.65 metres, with a width of 60 inches, which is around 1.52 metres. If you want a car to compare it to, the Morris Minor is the same width, that's 60 inches, but 4 inches longer in length. So it kind of gives you something that you can probably quite easily visualise and you've seen before. In terms of your running gear, we're talking about the engine and how it compares to the competition later on, but your suspension What's that? Well, your suspension is independent front suspension by coil springs, double wishbones and telescopic dampers. And for your rear, it's banjo type live axle with leaf springs with lever arm dampers. Now the brakes, as you probably expect, are drums all round. That's really normal for the era and exactly what I expected. And the steering is something which people love to pick apart on these. So let's talk about what it is. Well, it's not actually all that bad. First of all, I'll talk about it later on and I'll show you in action, but it's the Berman-Werman nut arrangement. Now, if you're quite familiar with standards, you'll have heard of it before because it's used on those early flying standards of the 30s. But hey, for a budget car, it's not bad at all. Now, if you're wondering what it was replaced by, because of course we've talked about Triumph being part of the standard family, it was then replaced with, I believe, the Triumph Herald. And look, for me, in many ways, I prefer the styling of this. But let's jump inside and have a proper look at these controls because, as you've probably spotted, we don't actually have that much today. Now, coming inside, it's almost a shame that we haven't tested a standard 8 before coming into the standard 10 because you get to see the real upgrade from what a basic 8 offered. And bear in mind, when they came into market, they were retailing at £580 after tax, which I believe was £80 cheaper than a Morris Minor, because that's really where the director of Standard saw them pitching themselves. That's who they thought their key competitor was. So when we get inside this, which is the Standard 10, let's talk about some of the upgrades or bits that you now get as standard in the 10 that you wouldn't have got in the 8. Well, first of all, let's talk about the small bits, which are things like the sun visors. We go from one sun visor on the driver's side to one on the passenger side as well. We also have 2 wipers. That's right, on a standard 8, you only got 1 wiper for the driver. There are other bits like, goodness, the windows in this now wind down. Previously, they were folding and everything else was fixed. You get a boot lid. I mean, can you imagine? That must have been such an upgrade to go from having nothing and having to pull the back seats out and all that faff if you're just trying to do a week's shop through to the 10 where you suddenly have that opening boot lid. It must have been for many people a massive step up. Now, I know a lot of you are looking at this dash and you're going to say to me, Steph, it's still very basic if we discount the modern bits and pieces that have been added in. And look, I know, but if you look at a Morris Minor of a similar age or an A30 of a similar age, you don't really get anything more. I mean, there's a couple of bits. So first of all, in this, you haven't got a glove box, you've just got this basic parcel shelf. Now, if you were going to look at a Morris Minor of a particular age, you would have got 2 glove boxes either side and you would have got that parcel shelf as well. So a wee bit more storage. And I know that you've obviously got the cubby hole on this side next to the Speedo. But really, unless you're trying to pack loads and loads into the car, that isn't a massive concern. Coming into the centre here, you'll notice this, which is a bit of a modern fitment that's been put in. And I do understand why that has been put in, because when you're driving a classic every day, oh my goodness, and you sit in that traffic and you're worried and you're thinking, is my engine overheating? Things like a temperature gauge, see if it's overheating, the voltmeter, the oil pressure gauge, all these little things are so useful for running a classic on the daily. The only real thing that you would have had in terms of indicating anything that was going on was this speedo and fuel gauge. That's all you would have got as standard, which now can feel quite like, oh God, but for people at the time, they're like, that's absolutely fine, that's all we need. Now, coming down from there, you've got your windscreen washers, you've got your side and headlights, you've got your heater, and you've got your wipers, single speed, just in case you're wondering, and you've got your choke there as well. And your heater controls are just this simple panel up here. Now today, the temperature, the highs today are 3 degrees, and for me that is absolutely freezing, so we won't be moving that down to cold. That will be sticking on hot with us today. Now, in terms of your gear change, the standard gearbox on these was 4 forward gears and reverse, although there was the Laycock overdrive, which I think you could get from March 1957, and they also did something called stand drive, which is some I've never fully understood how it works because I've never seen one in action, and I'm one of those people that needs to see one in action to fully understand how it works. But it was a very early-ish version of a semi-automatic. When you have a daily driver, there's always random bits and pieces that you find in people's cars, and this for me is so cute. Look at this little Dunlop tin, and inside it's just various little gubbins that you might need if something goes wrong. This is a really nice daily driver actually, and I just want to say this because when you get in many classic cars nowadays, they have been so sanitised and all the history's removed and everything's laid out like you're at a show 24/7, and it doesn't feel like a car that's lived a life or that feels like it's got much history to it sometimes, and it can feel so sanitised. Coming in here, there's all these bits and pieces, and it reminds me so much of when I dailied a Morris Minor, and you had various little bits and pieces, you had gauges, and you had little fuses and old matchboxes and stuff, and it's so nice to come in here. And I guess the condition on this as well is very much how they probably would have been in maybe the late 60s, the early 70s. So I really love just how this feels, and it's, do you know what, I've driven it a little bit as well, and I'm going to give you a spoiler that it's awfully nice to drive as well. Now, if we're talking comparisons and how this fares in terms of engine, bear in mind this has got that Triumph engine which they used, I think they used in like various formats until the 80s, and on this it's the 948 4-cylinder. Now if we look at the Morris Minor of a similar age, and I say this because the Morris Minor's engines change, I'm going to come to this in just a minute. When we look at the point of launch for this in 1954, the Morris Minor was spec'd out with an 803cc engine which had 30 brake horsepower. In this you've got 33, so it's basically this has got just an edge, but it does flip later on, so I'll explain. So in this, 33 brake horsepower. Morris Minor, 30 brake horsepower. This on test in the Motor Magazine, 69 miles per hour top speed. Morris Minor of the age when this launched, so 54, I think it's got a top speed of around 64, although I've never seen one hit that. Those 803s do not like being driven like that, and you shouldn't drive them like that. Anyway, when we get to this point, the game has slightly changed, because in late 56, for really starting to get going in early 57, the Morris Minor then swaps over to the 948, so that's the 948A series. And that is, I think, 38 brake horsepower, so it's slightly higher than this. And then I think you've got, again, a really similar top speed of high 60s for that. And that you can do high 60s in, you don't have too many problems. So by this point, when this one was sold in 1958, the Morris Minor provides a much more competitive offering than it did in 1954. But I just wanted to give you a bit of perspective on that and where it's sat with the competition. Now, if you're wondering what this sounds like, this engine sounds relatively nice. And by the way, if you do buy one of these and you do want to try and get it fixed up and you're worried about the engine or the bodywork, everything is available from the Standard Motor Club, I believe, or they will help you source it. And by the way, it's not push or pull start on this, it is just a key turn. Check we're in neutral. I've had to turn that heater off because it's so loud. Have a listen. See, that's definitely louder than a Minor's. Anyway, that's what it sounds like. Give it a rev. Right, let's go on an adventure. can I just say, I absolutely adore the sound of that straight cut gearbox. It's such a thing of cars of this era. Oh, it's such a thing of this cars of this era, and it's almost got that ghost train noise. It's like woo. Oh, I just love it. Now, as we come round, one of the things that grabs me on this is that we talked about that Berman steering when we were doing the walk around earlier, and I don't know, it does feel slightly antiquated, but you know what? One of the things to remember about that is that, yeah, it's antiquated, but they weren't designing a brand new car on a massive budget. The idea was that they were designing a car for those budget conscious, thrifty post-war Britons that wanted motoring but didn't have oodles of cash to spend. Now, as we put along, it's a wonderful car to do comparisons in, because I drive a Morris Minor all the time, so I can tell you what it's like compared to the competition. Now, first of all, it is, well, to me, I think it's a lot louder inside, and I don't know if that's because it's a lack of sound deadening that might have been there when it was new, but look, it's exactly as you'd expect for a 50s, 60s vehicle. You're never going to expect something that's really quiet unless you're going for something like a Rolls Royce. But for me, I think that's all part of the charm. That's what adds to the driving experience if you go for something of this age. Now, the one thing that I will give this is that the gearbox is a lot better than I was expecting. Because I spoke to a couple of people and they were like, oh, the gearboxes are never very good. But actually the gear change in this is just as easy as a Morris Minor. The steering is slightly heavier. It doesn't feel quite as roomy inside. I know I gave you those sizing stats when we were walking around, but there's plenty of room inside for 4 people. I mean, we've got 3 of us in the car today, and I don't think any of us feel it. I've got plenty of room around me, actually. And as someone who's slightly shorter in stature, I'm finding it incredibly easy to drive, although I have got the seat rolled forward as far as it will go. Now, in terms of visibility and comfort, these seats aren't as comfy as the Morris Minors. Morris Minors of this era are horsehair stuffed, and they're all sprung, and they're quite luxurious actually, and they're very, very comfortable even on long drives. These feel, I don't know, not quite as sumptuous as their rivals' offerings, but remember, it was cheaper. Now, something I do want to say is I think that you can see that heavy steering here in action. Oh my goodness. Is that a lot of people shy away from cars like this for a couple of reasons. Number one is they think that they're hard to drive, and realistically, once you've got the hang of it, something like this is not difficult to drive. It's easy to park, easy to manoeuvre, and most of all, it's easy to repair as well. Stuff like this is so easy to fix if it goes wrong. And I think the other thing that puts people off standards is that the parts aren't as readily available as things like the Austins, Minis, Morris Minors. Because of these, I think there were 175,000 made. By this point in 1958, you know, they were knocking on for nearly 1 million Morris Minors being sold, because of course 1960 sees the launch, 1960, 1961 sees the launch of the Minor Million, celebrating 1 million units. So it's natural that there are a lot more spares and a lot more advice and bigger groups and stuff out there for the Morris Minor. But something like this brings you just as much joy, and the club, the Standard Motor Club, do have all the bits and pieces that you need, and if they don't have the bits and pieces, they help you source it. They've got people that are incredibly knowledgeable in the club. In fact, it's one of the only car clubs where every single time I've met a member, I've just immediately connected with them and thought they were really lovely. It's such a great community. And as someone who's always wanted a Standard 10, it's been on my list for quite some time. And I mean, I always think to myself, God, get a bit of imagination, because I'm always going for these 50s, 60s saloons. I do like it. I don't think I like it as much as the Morris Minor, but I think that's more through familiarity. I think it represents a real charming take on that mid-century motoring. It's easy to steer, even though it's slightly heavier than that Minor, and actually the A35. But that shouldn't let anybody detract from them. They are charming to look at. you can fit loads of stuff. You saw that boot's got plenty of room in. The engine bay's got plenty of room around the engine, so that if you are working on it, you can do various bits and pieces. And with plenty of room around and 4 doors, it makes it a really attractive prospect for a car that you could enjoy with your friends as well. Now that's pretty much it from me today. I guess the one thing that I would improve about this is maybe the lighter steering. I'd chuck some sound deadening through it, and I don't know, I'd look to see if I can make those seats a wee bit comfier. But those are very small criticisms of a car that gave budget motoring to so many people, well, all over the world, because this wasn't just sold in Great Britain. I've really enjoyed my test today. Is a standard 10 still on my list? Well, I don't think I'd say no if a project came up, because I have really enjoyed myself today. But there are other cars that I've tested this year that have beaten it, like that absolutely gorgeous Humber Sceptre. I've still got my eye on that one. Now that's it from me today. I hope you've enjoyed the Standard 10 test. I want to just say a massive thank you to Gaz, who's had to give up his daily driver for the afternoon so that we can take it out for a drive. And of course, thank you to you at home for watching. But until next Sunday, well, until next weekend, when we're looking at, I think, a bit more Morris Marina repairs and another review, take care and drive safely.